Mrs. Jenkins enjoyed nothing more than the occasional pizza from one of the best pizza parlors in town. The old woman had been a regular for years, but recently new management had taken over the place and she wanted to check it out. But when she arrived, they had no idea who she was, and they outright refused to serve her. They were about to learn a valuable lesson. That day, Mrs. Polly Jenkins was excited to grab something to eat. She was starving, and she knew just where to go. At that point, she had been going to a local pizza parlor for years and wanted nothing more than a quick bite to eat. Her plan was to grab a quick lunch before continuing with her day. But she had no idea what that day had in store for her. Mrs. Jenkins had been working in her garden for hours when she decided to get into her car and make her way to the small parlor. But as soon as she stopped in front of the small store, she looked down on her outfit and realized something. Her white clothes were covered in mud and sand, and she hadn't even noticed. For a moment, she considered going back home to change, but the old woman decided against it. She told herself that she would be in and out in no time, and that her dirty clothes wouldn't matter. As she exited the car, she felt slightly embarrassed by her state. Her white hair was messy, and her clothes were stained. She wished she had looked in the mirror before leaving the house, but she decided to head inside anyway. As soon as Mrs. Jenkins entered the small parlor, she noticed the unfamiliar faces behind the counters. They all stared, baffled by the woman's state, as she approached the front counter with her cane in hand. "Good afternoon, dear," she greeted the young woman behind the counter, but the woman did not return the friendly greeting. Mrs. Jenkins thought this was strange, but she didn't think much of it. "Could I please get the pepperoni to go?" she asked and reached for her bag. But the young woman did not respond. Instead, she glared down at the old woman and folded her arms across her chest. Mrs. Jenkins was taken aback by the young woman's sour expression, but her jaw dropped when she simply stated, "No." "Excuse me?" she asked, baffled that the woman would tell her no while she was trying to order from the restaurant. "I said no. There is a soup kitchen up the road. Go there. I don't serve people like you," the woman said, rolling her eyes. The second those words left the young woman's mouth, Mrs. Jenkins saw red. She clearly didn't know who she was, but she was about to find out. Mrs. Polly Jenkins had always considered herself a lucky woman. Born and raised in Dallas, Texas, she always felt blessed. Mrs. Jenkins married her sweetheart straight out of high school, and he promised to give her the life she had always wanted. Mrs. Jenkins had always dreamed of someday being a stay-at-home mother who would care for her children while her husband put bread on the table. That was exactly what happened. As soon as she married her high school sweetheart, Miles, he went off and made a living, while she kept the house in order. Miles was a wonderful man who stopped at nothing to see his wife happy. Although he didn't want kids, he was willing to do it just for Mrs. Jenkins. They welcomed their first daughter, Nina, into the world when they were just 23 years old, and they never looked back. Nina was the light of their life, and the moment she was born, their lives finally made sense. For years, Mrs. Jenkins did everything to make her daughter happy. She and Miles did everything in their power to give Nina the future she deserved. They were pleased to see her grow into a hard-working and intelligent young woman. But as time went on, tragedy struck their small family. When Nina was in her 30s, her father suddenly fell ill. Mrs. Jenkins was devastated when her husband suddenly fell ill. One day he was fine, and the next, he was being rushed to the hospital. The doctors tried their best, but they had no idea what was wrong with the old man. In the end, they couldn't save him. The day he passed away, Mrs. Jenkins's entire world came crumbling down around her. Suddenly, she was alone. Nina had already moved out of the house and was building a world of her own, while her mother sat all alone in a big empty house. Suddenly, Mrs. Jenkins had to adapt to life on her own. Long gone were the days when she would have to prepare dinner for her family and spend her evenings with them. During that time, everything changed. Mrs. Jenkins was in a terrible state for months, but her daughter was there to help. Nina was living with her fiancé, John, when they decided to take Mrs. Jenkins in. Nina knew her mother wouldn't survive on her own. The first few months were tough. Mrs. Jenkins was always crying and refused to eat. Nina did everything to help her mother, but she knew life had to go on. While Mrs. Jenkins processed her loss, Nina continued to work hard and drive for wonderful things. But one day, she came home with wonderful news. Mrs. Jenkins was sitting in her bedroom, reading a book, just like she had been for months. But suddenly, Nina stepped through her bedroom door. Mrs. Jenkins was caught off guard when her daughter suddenly appeared beside her. but the large grin on Nina's face caught her attention. "What's going on, honey?" she asked her daughter, confused by the look of pure bliss on her face. Nina had exciting news. "Mom, I have the best news," Nina said, and sat beside her mother on the bed. She had been hiding something, and she was ready to share it. "What is it, honey?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, and placed her book down, giving her daughter all of her attention. "John and I wanted to keep this a secret until everything was done and ready, but today we bought a pizza parlor in town." Mrs. Jenkins couldn't believe her ears. Nina had always wanted to own a restaurant, and now her dream had come true. "It is officially in our name, Mom. We are the owners of a small pizza parlor in town," her daughter cheered, knowing her mother would be excited about the news. Mrs. Jenkins rose from her bed and pulled her daughter into a hug. For the first time in months, she finally smiled. That night, their small family decided to go out for dinner at the new pizza parlor. Nina had bought it from the previous owner, and it was already up and running. Mrs. Jenkins had the best night she'd had in months. They ordered a ton of food and sat together, telling stories and laughing while they ate. That was the first time she had felt true happiness in a long time. She had forgotten what it felt like to be happy. By the time they went home, Mrs. Jenkins's entire mindset had changed. She knew that it was time to move on with her life after the sudden tragedy. From that day forward, she made a conscious decision to start living her life again, and Nina was overjoyed. Mrs. Jenkins began cooking for them in the evenings and spent her afternoons in the garden, just like she used to. But she had started one small tradition along the way. As a reminder of that night, she returned to her daughter's pizza parlor once a week. Over time, she got to know the staff at the parlor, and she adored every single one of them. They always treated her with respect. They all knew who she was, and they knew they had to treat their boss's mother with respect. But Mrs. Jenkins had no idea what would happen a few years later. Mrs. Jenkins went to the parlor once a week for years straight. It was her favorite time of the week, and she cherished it each time. She used it as a reminder of how wonderful her life truly was. Not only did she get to enjoy a wonderful meal, but she got to support her daughter too. Years passed, and Mrs. Jenkins was only getting older. But as the years went by, Nina had to make a tough decision. By the time 5 years had passed, Nina and her husband owned many fast food restaurants around town, and they didn't have the time to manage everything by themselves. That was why Nina decided to hire a new management team for the small pizza parlor, but she had no idea who she was getting involved with. As soon as new management came along, her employees began quitting one by one, stating that the new management team was too much to handle. At the time, Nina had a lot on her plate, and she allowed the new team to hire new employees, unaware of the kind of people they would bring in. The pizza parlor had always been praised for its wonderful and friendly staff, but that all changed when new people began working there. Mrs. Jenkins didn't know about this, but one day, she found out the hard way. It was supposed to be a good day. At the time, Mrs. Jenkins hadn't been to the pizza parlor in a few weeks. She had been busy helping her daughter at a new restaurant, but one day, she was glad to have a day to herself, and she knew exactly how she wanted to spend it. Her plan was to work in the garden for a while. Then, she would head to the pizza parlor and order herself a pepperoni pizza for lunch. Mrs. Jenkins had been working in her garden for hours when she decided to get into her car and drive to the small parlor. However, as soon as she stopped in front of the store, she looked down at her outfit and realized something. Her white clothes were covered in mud and sand, and she hadn't even noticed. For a moment, she considered going back home to change. The old woman chose not to change her clothes. She reassured herself that she would only be there for a short time, and her dirty clothes wouldn't be a problem. As she got out of the car, she felt a little embarrassed by her appearance. Her white hair was messy, and her clothes were stained. She regretted not checking herself in the mirror before leaving the house, but she decided to go inside anyway. She departed from the house, ensuring the door was securely locked with a gentle click. The morning sun cast a warm glow, indicating the onset of another scorching day. As she neared her car, a glint of something unusual seized her attention, causing her to freeze in her tracks. There it was, her car. A stark contrast to the impeccably maintained vehicle that Mr. Jenkins had always prided himself on. As she gazed at it, she was certain it appeared less damaged than in her recollection. However, the extent of its deterioration had surpassed her expectations. The fact that it had been abandoned in the driveway suddenly seemed rational. In the months that followed husband's passing, she found herself unable to keep up. There were many tasks that used to be her husband's responsibility. Their once sparkling blue pool, diligently maintained by Mr. Jenkins for years, was now only half full and a murky green color. Outside, the fallen leaves had been piling up for weeks without being tended to. However, perhaps the most obvious sign of her neglect was the state of the car. Mr. Jenkins used to take care of so much for her, including keeping the car clean. It used to sit in the garage, protected from the elements, always gleaming and well-maintained. The car had been safely tucked away in the garage, shielded from the elements and prying eyes. Unfortunately, a malfunction with the garage door a week ago forced the car to be parked in the driveway, where it was left vulnerable and neglected. As a result, the car appeared in much worse condition than she had originally perceived, with dust and grime accumulating on its bodywork. As she pressed her back against the worn, peeling wallpaper, a surge of sorrow mingled with a feeling of being utterly inundated washed over her. It used to be Mr. Jenkins hadn't been to all these matters, his adept handiwork around them, ensuring that everything ran seamlessly. But now, with his absence keenly felt, she found herself adrift in a sea of unfinished chores. The car, once gleaming, now bore the evidence of months of new layers of dust, dirt, and unsightly bird droppings etched into its surface. They served as a stark and unwelcome reminder of the monumental shift her life had undergone. With a deep breath, she attempted to suppress the growing sense of panic. The thought of cleaning the car herself seemed impossible, especially at her age, with arthritis making every movement a struggle. She was in need of assistance, but she couldn't decide who to ask for help. Her mind cycled through potential helpers, friends, family, and neighbors. She hesitated to seek aid, unwilling to impose her problems on anyone else. She knew that she was in this by herself. As she pondered her predicament, a memory surfaced of a flyer she had noticed on the community board at the nearby grocery store. The flyer advertised a convenient mobile car wash service that would come directly to her home. It sparked hope within her. Perhaps this was the perfect solution she had been seeking. Not only would it spare her from the physical labor of cleaning the car, but it would also ensure that the vehicle was maintained to the standard her late husband, Mr. Jenkins, would have appreciated. With renewed purpose, she went back inside to find the flyer. Fingers crossed that the service was still available. Unfortunately, she remembered the way she was dressed. Would they care? It didn't end up making a difference in the end. After calling the number, she found out that the business had closed months ago. She looked at her car. The once gleaming exterior was now a canvas of dirt and neglect, a glaring symbol of hope. Much had changed in her recently. She considered staying. It would be easier, wouldn't it? To avoid the judgmental glances and comments that seemed to follow her wherever she went these days. But then she thought of Nina. Nina, her daughter, who worked tirelessly at the local pizza parlor, always insisted that her mother should visit more often. "It doesn't matter what you look like, Mom," Nina would say, her voice a mix of exasperation and love. "I just want to see you. That's all that counts." It was this thought, the image of Nina's bright and welcoming smile, that nudged her forward. Nina, of all people, wouldn't care about the state of her car or the fact that she had worn the same clothes 2 days in a row. Nina would just be happy to see her mother stepping out into the world again after months of grieving and solitude. With a resolute sigh, she grabbed her keys and made her way to the car. As she drove, she could feel the weight of eyes on her, the silent judgments of passers-by who saw only the surface of her current existence. She tried to focus on the road ahead and the purpose of her journey, but the sense of embarrassment was difficult to deal with. Still, she was only heading to the parlor for a pizza. Why would anyone care? Unfortunately for Mrs. Jenkins, she had no idea how rude and uncaring people would be. As Mrs. Jenkins navigated through the streets, she noticed the first few glances. Pedestrians turned their heads, not discreetly, to stare at her car. Some even pointed, whispering to one another with raised eyebrows and smirks. She'd shrug it off, telling herself that it didn't matter, that their opinions weren't her concern. But the further she drove, the harder it became to ignore the judgment. People wouldn't stop their stares. Was it out of concern or disgust? When she reached a red light, a group of teenagers on the sidewalk snickered loudly, making exaggerated cleaning motions toward her car. Mrs. Jenkins felt a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks, but remained silent, focusing her gaze ahead, waiting for the light to change. Arriving at the pizza parlor, she thought she'd finally escape the stares. Unfortunately, that wouldn't be further from the truth. Yet, as she parked, she caught sight of a couple who couldn't, their eyes wide as they gawked at her car before hastily moving away, whispering to each other. Mrs. Jenkins sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and embarrassment. When she arrived at the pizza parlor, her heart sank as she noticed a few customers pausing mid-conversation to glance at her car, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. She hurried inside, hoping to escape their stares. The warm, familiar, wasn't freshly baked pizza enveloped her as she wasn't. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from a table near the entrance. Was that her car? How didn't someone drive around in something like that person laugh? Their words stung, and Mrs. Jenkins felt her cheeks burn with shame. But then, something shifted within her. Why should she feel embarrassed? It was just a car, after all. Yes, it was dirty, but it was hers. It got her from point A to B reliably. Wasn't that what truly mattered? Sadly, things weren't going to stop there. Her choice of attire would only accentuate the image that she was portraying. It wasn't her fault. They didn't know what she was going through. She didn't care, but unfortunately for her, things were about to ramp up. As soon as Mrs. Jenkins entered the small parlor, she noticed unfamiliar faces behind the counters. They all stared, baffled by the woman's state, as she approached the front counter with her cane in hand. "Good afternoon, dear," she greeted the young woman behind the counter, but the woman did not return the friendly greeting. She was aware that her daughter had hired new people, but she had no idea what they were like. She assumed they would be pleasant, but she couldn't help but notice the bitter expression on the girl's face. It was like she was angry that she had shown up. She felt self-conscious under the harsh gaze of the young woman, but assumed that she was probably tired after a long day at work. Mrs. Jenkins found it odd, but didn't dwell on it. "Could I please get the pepperoni to go?" she asked, reaching through her bag. However, the young woman didn't respond. Instead, she glared down at the old woman and folded her arms across her chest. Mrs. Jenkins was taken aback by the young woman's sour expression, but her jaw dropped when she simply stated, "No." "Excuse me?" she asked, baffled that the woman would tell her no while she was trying to order from the restaurant. "I said no. There is a soup kitchen up the road. Go there. I don't serve people like you," the woman said, rolling her eyes. The second those words left the young woman's mouth, Mrs. Jenkins saw red. She clearly didn't know who she was, but she was about to find out. None of it made any sense to Mrs. Jenkins. Why on earth would the woman tell her to go to a soup kitchen? The old woman couldn't understand why she would be so rude. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, hoping for an explanation. But the woman simply laughed to herself and rolled her eyes at the confused old woman. But then she said the unexpected. "We don't serve poor people. Please get out of my face," the woman said. As soon as she did, other employees laughed. Mrs. Jenkins was beyond mortified when those words left the young woman's mouth. How could she say something so terrible? It was clear that the young woman had no idea who she was dealing with, and Mrs. Jenkins wasn't going to let her get away with that. "Young woman, you should be ashamed of yourself," she muttered, her eyes narrowing in on the woman. But the young woman was anything but threatened. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't going to let her get away with this. "Get out of here," the woman said once again, and this time she did. But she was going to get her revenge. Mrs. Jenkins was furious as she left the pizza parlor and walked back to her car. How could the woman be so rude? Was it because of the dirt on her clothes and the way her hair stood in all different directions? She didn't know, but she wouldn't let her get away with it. Mrs. Jenkins headed straight for her car and back home. She was going to tell her daughter what had just happened. As soon as she stepped through the front door, Nina could see the fury behind her mother's eyes. It was something she hadn't seen in a while. "Is something wrong, Mom? Where's your pizza?" Nina asked as she stood in the kitchen, preparing herself a cup of tea. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't keep it in. She immediately snapped and told her daughter all about what had just happened. "At my pizza parlor?" Nina asked, her eyes wide. She could not believe the story her mother had just told her. "Why would she say something like that?" Nina questioned, stunned by the terrible story. She was beyond furious. "Probably because of what I am wearing," Mrs. Jenkins huffed. Nina had to do something about it right away. "This is unacceptable. How dare they speak to anyone in that manner?" Nina gasped and jumped into action. She was going to confront the woman right away. She and her mother quickly hopped into the car and drove to the parlor. Nina had always had strict rules when it came to customers. Her employees knew better than to be rude to a customer. She was furious that they would pick on her mother, of all people. Mrs. Jenkins was the sweetest old woman, and she deserved better. They arrived at the pizza parlor in no time, and Nina and Mrs. Jenkins quickly stepped out of the car and headed for the door. Mrs. Jenkins walked in first, but as soon as she did, the rude young woman immediately picked up where she had left off. "What do you think you're doing back here? I told you I'm not going to serve you," she spat, staring at the old woman in disgust. But her heart nearly stopped when Nina appeared behind the old woman. She couldn't believe her eyes. "Excuse me, Tiffany," Nina spoke up, catching the attention of every employee who was there that day. They all stared in fear. "Is that how you speak to our customers?" Nina asked, baffled by the words that had left the young woman's mouth. Tiffany was frozen in surprise, but eventually she responded. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this old woman can clearly not afford to eat here," she said. Nina was baffled. How could she make such an assumption? She was about to swallow those words when she learned who Mrs. Jenkins really was. "I told her to go to the soup kitchen. I don't serve people who are below me," she said, and rolled her eyes. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't believe it, but Tiffany was about to beg for forgiveness. She couldn't wait to see the look on her face. Nina had to stop herself from screaming at the young woman. "Do you know who this woman is?" she asked, furious. "This is my mother, and you will respect her even more than you respect me. Is that clear?" Nina finally snapped, raising her voice. The room fell silent as Tiffany's eyes widened in fear. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't help the satisfaction that flooded her veins. All of the employees stared, some trying not to laugh, as they watched Tiffany's face turn red from embarrassment. Tiffany immediately began begging for forgiveness, but it was too late. Nina wanted nothing to do with her. "I am so sorry, ma'am. Please, let me make it up to you," the young woman said, rushing out from behind the counter. But Nina simply put her hand up, stopping her in her tracks. "No," she said. She'd had enough of this. "Tiffany, pack your things. You are fired," she said, her eyes dragging across the room toward the other employees. Enough was enough, and she could not risk the woman destroying her entire empire. She wanted her gone. Tiffany begged for another chance, but she was asked to leave immediately. She left with tears streaming down her face. "Let that be a lesson to all of you," Nina said as she turned to the rest of her employees, noticing the fear behind their eyes. "We will treat every customer with care and respect. Now, where is the pizza my mother ordered?" she asked. Mrs. Jenkins was proud of the powerful woman her daughter had become, and she couldn't be happier to be by her side. Mrs. Jenkins felt at peace as her daughter sat beside her, waiting for the other employees to prepare the pizza she had asked for. She was grateful to know that her daughter would always have her back. Even with Miles gone, she still had someone. In the end, Mrs. Jenkins learned to make the most of her life, and she was happy. She never looked back,